April 29th, 1945. 11:47 a.m. Somewhere in Bavaria, 30 kilometers northeast of Munich. The convoy had stopped beside a line of poplar trees whose leaves shivered in the spring wind. And Obergefreiter Klaus Mendel could smell the diesel exhaust mixing with the scent of wet earth, and something else he couldn't identify at first. Something sweet, almost floral, utterly foreign to the last 6 years of his life. He sat in the back of the American truck with 19 other German soldiers, their uniforms torn and filthy, their faces hollowed by hunger, and the particular exhaustion that comes from knowing a war is lost. The steel chains they had been issued at the makeshift processing center near Augsburg lay coiled at their feet, unused. Mendel stared at those chains and felt a cold knot of certainty in his stomach. They were being transported somewhere to be shackled, worked to death, or simply executed in a field far from witnesses or records. That was what defeated soldiers received. That was the mathematics of collapse. The American lieutenant who commanded the convoy, a man whose name Mendel would never learn, walked down the line of trucks carrying a cardboard box under one arm and a steel canister under the other. He was young, perhaps 23, with the kind of clean-shaven face that suggested regular meals and uninterrupted sleep. Luxuries that seemed as distant to Mendel as peacetime itself. When the lieutenant reached Mendel's truck, he set the box down on the tailgate with a hollow thump and began distributing its contents. White paper cups, steam rising from each one in delicate wisps that caught the afternoon light. Coffee, real coffee, not the acorn and chicory substitute that had sustained the Wehrmacht for the past 2 years, but actual coffee with a smell so rich and complex that Mendel felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes before he could stop them. "Here you go, fellas," the lieutenant said in accented but comprehensible German, handing cups through the crowd of prisoners. "Drink up. We've got a ways to go yet." Mendel took the cup with both hands, feeling the warmth seep into his fingers, and stared at the dark liquid as though it might vanish if he blinked. Beside him, Gefreiter Hoffmann, a Berliner who had survived Stalingrad and the retreat across Poland, let out a sound halfway between a laugh and a sob. "They're poisoning us," Hoffmann whispered. "That's what this is. Poison tastes sweet." But the lieutenant was already moving down the line with a second box. This one filled with small white packages that Mendel recognized immediately, even though he hadn't seen one in 4 years. American cigarettes. Lucky Strikes. The lieutenant distributed them with the same casual efficiency, tossing packs into waiting hands, and several of the prisoners simply held the cigarettes without opening them, as though the objects themselves were too valuable or too surreal to actually use. Mendel tore open his pack with trembling fingers and lit one with a match the lieutenant offered, drawing the smoke deep into his lungs and feeling a rush of nicotine that made his head swim. It was the finest cigarette he had ever tasted in his life. "No chains?" Hoffmann asked the lieutenant directly, pointing at the coils of steel at their feet. His voice carried the flat, dead quality of a man who no longer expected mercy but felt compelled to confirm its absence. The lieutenant glanced at the chains and shook his head. "Those? Nah. We brought them in case anyone got rowdy during transport. But you boys have been pretty cooperative." He smiled, and clapped Hoffmann on the shoulder. "Enjoy your coffee. We'll be at the camp in about an hour." The trucks rumbled back to life, and the convoy continued northeast through the Bavarian countryside, past villages where white sheets hung from windows in surrender, and past fields where farmers worked their land with the same methodical patience they had shown through 6 years of war. Mendel sipped his coffee slowly and making it last, and watched the landscape roll by while the other prisoners smoked their American cigarettes and spoke in low, disbelieving voices about what had just happened. No one could explain it. No one could reconcile the chains at their feet with the coffee in their hands. The propaganda they had been fed for years about the barbarism of the Allies with the casual generosity of the lieutenant who had just given them Lucky Strikes and wished them well. Mendel had been a school teacher before the war, a man who believed in the power of logic and evidence. And he could not make the mathematics of this moment add up to any conclusion that fit his understanding of how the world worked after defeat. The camp they arrived at was not what Mendel had imagined. and his imagination had run through every possibility during the long months of retreat from the Vistula to the Alps. Barbed wire electrified with enough voltage to kill a man on contact. Guard towers with machine guns trained on overcrowded pens. Forced labor details that would grind them down to bone and gristle before winter came again. What he saw instead, as the trucks passed through the main gate, was a sprawling complex of white canvas tents, arranged in neat geometric rows, each one marked with red crosses and unit designations painted on wooden signs that looked freshly made. There were American soldiers everywhere, but they moved with the unhurried confidence of men performing routine tasks rather than the tense vigilance of guards expecting rebellion or escape attempts at any moment. A baseball game was in progress on a makeshift diamond near the camp's southern perimeter, and Mendel could hear the crack of a bat connecting with a ball and the subsequent cheering from a group of GIs who had gathered to watch during their break from duty. The impossible claim had reached them 2 days earlier, whispered through the columns of surrendering soldiers like a rumor too absurd to be taken seriously. The Americans were not executing prisoners, were not starving them, were in fact feeding them better than the Wehrmacht had fed its own troops during the final year of the war. Mendel had dismissed it as the kind of desperate fantasy that emerges among defeated men who need to believe that surrender offers some alternative to annihilation. But now he stood in the processing line with his empty coffee cup still clutched in one hand and watched American medics distribute wool blankets and cans of something labeled Spam to the new arrivals. And he felt the foundations of his understanding begin to crack like winter ice under spring thaw. "Propaganda," muttered Hauptmann Dietrich, a tank commander from the 6th Panzer Army who stood 3 places ahead of Mendel in the line. Dietrich had been a true believer until the very end. One of those officers who insisted that wonder weapons and strategic genius would turn the tide even as Soviet artillery reduced Berlin to rubble and American bombers turned German cities into moonscapes of ash and broken stone. "This is a show for the Red Cross inspectors. Wait until the cameras leave, then we'll see what they really have planned for us." But the cameras never left. Or rather, there were no cameras to begin with, only the grinding machinery of American logistics operating at a scale that seemed to defy basic arithmetic. The processing took 4 hours, and during that time, Mendel was photographed, fingerprinted, deloused, issued a clean uniform, American manufacture, dyed gray, and stamped with PW on the back. Given a medical examination by a bored-looking captain who spoke no German but communicated through gestures, and a translator that Mendel's malnutrition was severe but treatable, and finally assigned to Tent 47B in Section 9 of the camp complex. He received a toothbrush, a bar of soap that smelled like pine forests, a razor with 3 fresh blades, and a small booklet printed in German that explained the camp rules and the provisions of the Geneva Convention regarding the treatment of prisoners of war. The booklet felt substantial in his hands, professionally printed on good paper stock. And Mendel found himself reading the same sentence over and over. Prisoners of war are entitled to adequate food, shelter, and medical care, and shall not be subjected to physical punishment or degradation. By nightfall, 17,000 German prisoners occupied the camp that American engineers had constructed in 11 days using prefabricated components shipped from factories in Ohio and Pennsylvania. And Mendel sat on his cot in Tent 47B, surrounded by men who could not stop talking about the dinner they had just been served. Reconstituted potatoes, canned beef that actually contained recognizable meat, white bread made from real wheat flour, and coffee so plentiful that the mess sergeants encouraged 2nd and 3rd cups. Hoffman had eaten until he vomited behind the latrine, his shrunken stomach unable to process the sudden abundance. But even that humiliation carried a strange note of joy because it meant the food was real and not some elaborate theatrical production designed to deceive them before the true punishment began. "I was at Rheinberg," said a voice from the cot across from Mendel's. And the tent fell silent because everyone knew what Rheinberg meant. The British camp where tens of thousands of German prisoners had been held in open fields without shelter or adequate rations, where dysentery and exposure had killed men by the hundreds. The speaker was an older soldier, perhaps 45, with the weathered face of a career NCO who had seen too many campaigns to believe in miracles. I was there for 3 weeks before they transferred me here. We slept in mud. We ate once a day if we were lucky. Men died standing up because there was no room to lie down. He paused and looked around the tent at the canvas walls that kept out the rain, at the electric lights powered by American generators that hummed somewhere beyond the perimeter. This is not that. I don't know what this is, but it is not that. Mendel lay back on his cot and stared at the canvas ceiling and tried to calculate the mathematics of what he had witnessed. The coffee and cigarettes distributed with casual generosity. The medical care administered by professionals who seemed genuinely concerned about the health of enemy soldiers. The food served in quantities that exceeded what German civilians were receiving in the occupied zones. The blankets and uniforms and soap and razor blades that appeared to flow from an inexhaustible source somewhere beyond the horizon of his comprehension. The mockery came from Dietrich 3 days later, during the afternoon work detail when a group of prisoners had been assigned to help unload supply trucks at the camp's central depot. Not forced labor in the sense that Mendel understood it, but voluntary work that earned modest privileges like extra cigarette rations and access to a recreation tent where American magazines and newspapers were available for reading. Dietrich stood beside a flatbed truck stacked with wooden crates marked with shipping labels from places called Fort Dix and Camp Kilmer, and watched as American sergeants directed the unloading operation with clipboards and manifests. And his face twisted into something between a sneer and a grimace that suggested he had finally reached the limit of what his ideology could accommodate without complete collapse. "They want us to believe this is normal," Dietrich said, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "They want us to think that giving away mountains of supplies to captured enemies is standard operating procedure for a conquering army. It's theater. It has to be theater." He pointed at a crate being lifted by 2 prisoners, a container roughly 1 meter square that bore stenciled warnings about fragile contents and careful handling. "You know what's in those? Medical supplies? Enough sulfa powder and penicillin to treat a division for 3 months. And they're just handing it out to us like it grows on trees. Like they have so much they don't know what to do with it all." "Maybe they do," said a young prisoner named Werner, a former student from Heidelberg who had been conscripted in the war's final months, and had spent exactly 4 days in combat before surrendering to an American patrol near Nuremberg. "Maybe they really do have that much." Dietrich laughed, a harsh sound without humor. "Impossible. No nation on Earth can produce medicine in those quantities while simultaneously fighting a 2-front war across 2 oceans. The mathematics don't work. Someone is lying to us. Or the Americans are bankrupting themselves to create an illusion of abundance that will collapse the moment we look away." He turned and addressed the work detail directly, his voice carrying the commanding tone he had perfected during 3 years of leading men into battle. "Mark my words, in 6 months, maybe less, the food will dry up, the medicine will stop flowing, and we'll discover what they're really capable of. This generosity is a trick. A psychological operation designed to make us compliant while they figure out what to actually do with millions of prisoners they never planned to capture. But the supplies kept coming. And over the following week, Mendel began to understand that what he was witnessing was not generosity in any traditional sense, but rather the visible surface of an industrial system so vast and so ruthlessly efficient that it could afford to treat captured enemies better than those enemies had treated themselves during the height of their own military power. The evidence arrived in the form of documents that circulated through the camp, copies of American newspapers that prisoners found in the recreation tent, Stars and Stripes editions that the guards distributed freely because they apparently saw no security risk in letting enemy soldiers read about the industrial capacity that had defeated them. Mendel collected these documents with the same methodical care he had once applied to grading student essays. And he began to assemble a picture that his mind struggled to fully accept even as the numbers stared back at him from the printed page with undeniable authority. The United States had produced 300,000 aircraft between 1940 and 1945. a figure so large that Mendel initially assumed it was a misprint or a propaganda exaggeration. But multiple sources confirmed it and broke down the production by type and manufacturer. 75,000 P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts, 35,000 B-17 and B-24 heavy bombers, transport planes and trainers and observation aircraft rolling off assembly lines at rates that would have seemed fantastic, even for automobile production in peacetime. American shipyards had launched a new destroyer every 10 days and a new aircraft carrier every 6 weeks. And the merchant fleet that sustained the logistics network across 2 oceans included 8,000 Liberty ships constructed using prefabricated components and welding techniques that reduced build time from 8 months to 42 days. The numbers kept multiplying, spiraling outward into domains that Mendel had never considered because the German war economy had operated under such different constraints. The Americans had manufactured 6 million rifles in a single year, enough to arm every man in the Wehrmacht twice over. And they had done so while simultaneously producing 12 billion rounds of ammunition, 88,000 tanks, 2 million trucks, and enough food to feed not only their own forces, but also significant portions of the British and Soviet armies through Lend-Lease agreements that moved millions of tons of supplies across submarine-infested waters, with losses that the industrial system absorbed and replaced faster than German U-boats could possibly inflict damage. It was the mathematics of overproduction, of waste elevated to strategic doctrine, of an economy so enormous that it could afford to give enemy prisoners coffee and cigarettes and medical care because the marginal cost of doing so barely registered against the tsunami of material pouring out of factories that operated 24 hours a day in cities that had never felt the touch of enemy bombers or the hunger of blockade. Mendel sat in tent 47B with his collection of newspapers spread across his cot and tried to explain what he had learned to Hoffman and Werner and the others who gathered to hear him speak in his old teacher's voice, calm and precise and utterly bewildered by the implications of what he was describing. They built more aircraft in 1944 alone than Germany produced during the entire war, Mendel said, holding up a copy of Stars and Stripes dated March 15, 1945. More tanks than we had in our entire Panzer Force at any single moment. More trucks in 1 year than we manufactured in 12 years of Nazi governance. The technical zoom came during Mendel's 5th week in the camp, when American officers organized what they called an orientation lecture for captured German soldiers who had held positions of technical or administrative responsibility during the war. Engineers and factory managers and logistics officers who were invited, not ordered, to attend a presentation in the camp's largest assembly tent on a warm afternoon in late May when the Bavarian sky stretched blue and cloudless overhead. Mendel qualified by virtue of his pre-war occupation, though teaching secondary school mathematics seemed laughably irrelevant compared to the credentials of the other attendees. Men who had designed aircraft engines and managed steel production facilities and coordinated railway networks under constant Allied bombardment. The American captain who conducted the lecture was a thin man named Morrison, who spoke fluent German with a slight Bavarian accent and explained that he had studied in Munich during the 1930s before returning home to work for something called the War Production Board, an organization that Mendel had never heard of, but which Morrison described as the central nervous system coordinating American industrial mobilization. Morrison stood beside a large easel holding charts and diagrams and began his presentation with a single question. How many man-hours do you think it took to build a B-24 Liberator bomber in 1945? The room filled with murmurs and whispered calculations, and several of the German engineers called out estimates ranging from 30,000 to 50,000 hours based on their knowledge of aircraft production under wartime conditions. Morrison smiled and flipped to his first chart, which showed a photograph of an assembly line at the Willow Run plant in Michigan, a facility so vast that its main production floor stretched more than 1 kilometer from end to end and employed 42,000 workers operating in 3 shifts that never stopped. 18,000 man-hours, Morrison said, and the number hung in the air like a physical presence. That's how long it took to build one B-24 at Willow Run in early 1944. By the end of that year, we had reduced it to 13,000 hours. And by March 1945, we were down to 10,000 hours per aircraft. The engineering officers in the audience began to object, their professional expertise rejecting figures that violated everything they understood about manufacturing complexity and quality control. But Morrison raised his hand for silence and continued. Willow Run produced one B-24 every 63 minutes during peak production. That's not one aircraft per day or per week. That's one aircraft every single hour, around the clock, for months on end. The plant consumed 16,000 tons of aluminum per month, which arrived on dedicated rail lines directly from smelting facilities in Tennessee and Washington state. It required 700,000 square feet of floor space just for final assembly. And the logistics of moving components through that space were so complex that we built an internal railway system with its own locomotives and freight cars to transport fuselage sections and wing assemblies from feeder buildings to the main line. Morrison paused and looked directly at the assembled prisoners. His expression neutral, but his voice carrying a weight that suggested he understood exactly how impossible his claim sounded. And Willow Run was just one plant. We had 5 major facilities producing heavy bombers, plus dozens of smaller factories making components and subsystems. The system worked because we designed it to work at scale, because we accepted waste and redundancy as necessary costs of maintaining production tempo, because we had enough electrical power and raw materials and skilled labor that we could afford to build things faster than was strictly efficient by traditional engineering standards. The second chart showed power consumption statistics that made Mendel's head spin. American electrical generation capacity in 1944 had reached 180 billion kilowatt hours, enough to power every factory and home and military installation across a continent, while still maintaining civilian living standards that exceeded pre-war German prosperity by comfortable margins. The aluminum industry alone consumed more electricity than the entire German economy had generated in 1938. And that was just one sector among dozens competing for resources that somehow never seemed to run short despite the enormous demands of total war. Steel production reached 89 million tons in 1944. Petroleum refining supplied 7 million barrels per day. And the agricultural sector produced such massive food surpluses that American civilians never experienced rationing on the scale that German families had endured since 1942. And still there was enough excess to feed Allied armies and sustain Lend-Lease commitments and, apparently, provide 3 meals a day to millions of enemy prisoners without straining the system in any measurable way. Morrison's third chart detailed the logistics network that moved all this material from factories to fighting fronts. 12,000 locomotives hauling 2 million freight cars across 200,000 miles of railway track, supplemented by a trucking fleet that consumed more rubber and petroleum than the entire Wehrmacht had possessed at the height of its power. Supported by a merchant marine that delivered 40 million tons of cargo across the Atlantic in 1944 alone, despite U-boat campaigns that sank hundreds of ships, but could not slow the tide of supplies enough to matter strategically. The scale defied comprehension, but Morrison presented it with the calm precision of a man reciting multiplication tables. And he supported every claim with documentation that he invited the prisoners to examine. Production reports from the War Production Board, shipping manifests from the Maritime Commission, photographs of assembly lines and convoy operations that showed the machinery of American industry in relentless motion. It was the mathematics of overproduction, Morrison concluded, echoing the phrase that had lodged itself in Mendel's thoughts like a splinter working its way deeper into flesh. We didn't try to match German engineering quality part for part. We built systems that could produce adequate equipment in quantities large enough that quality became almost irrelevant. A Sherman tank was inferior to a Tiger in direct combat, but we built 50,000 Shermans while Germany built fewer than 1,500 Tigers. And at that ratio, the mathematics are simple. The central set piece that collapsed Mendel's remaining doubts occurred on June 12, 1945, when American authorities transported 300 German prisoners, including Mendel himself, to a former Wehrmacht supply depot near Stuttgart, that had been converted into a distribution center for Red Cross parcels and humanitarian aid destined for displaced persons camps throughout the American occupation zone. The purpose of the trip was never clearly explained, though the American major who accompanied them suggested that seeing the scale of relief operations might help the prisoners understand what reconstruction would require in the months ahead. And Mendel suspected the real motivation was simpler. The Americans wanted German soldiers to witness firsthand the industrial capacity that had defeated them, to see with their own eyes what mockery and denial could not explain away. The depot occupied 40 hectares of flat land that had once held ammunition stockpiles and fuel reserves, but those materials had been cleared away and replaced with mountains of crated supplies stacked in neat, geometric rows that stretched farther than Mendel could see clearly in the morning haze. They arrived at dawn when the facility was just beginning its daily operations, and Mendel watched American trucks pull up to loading bays in steady succession, each vehicle receiving a manifest from clipboard-wielding sergeants who checked off items with the methodical efficiency of grocery clerks, rather than soldiers managing a conquered nation's survival. The first warehouse they toured held medical supplies exclusively, penicillin and sulfa drugs and morphine, in quantities that would have supplied every German military hospital for a year, plus surgical instruments and bandages and plasma bottles stacked on pallets that rose 3 meters high and extended in rows so long that Mendel lost count after passing the 20th column. An American lieutenant named Patterson, who served as their guide, explained that this warehouse represented 1 week's allocation for the Stuttgart region, that identical facilities operated in Munich and Frankfurt and Berlin and a dozen other cities, that the supplies arrived on trains and trucks that ran on schedules as regular as peacetime passenger service. "How much did all this cost?" asked a German logistics officer named Schmidt, a man who had spent 3 years managing supply lines for Army Group Center and understood exactly how impossible it was to maintain this level of distribution under any normal economic constraints. His voice carried genuine curiosity rather than challenge, the question of a professional seeking to understand a system that operated according to rules he had never encountered. Patterson shrugged as though the question was fundamentally irrelevant. "I honestly don't know the dollar figures, and I don't think anyone's really tracking it that way. Congress appropriated funds for occupation and relief. The supplies get ordered, they show up. We distribute them. It's just how the system works." He gestured at the warehouse interior with a sweep of his arm that took in thousands of crates and millions of dollars worth of medicine that had been manufactured, packaged, shipped across an ocean, and now sat waiting to save lives among a defeated enemy population. "We produce so much during the war that we've got surpluses of almost everything. Makes more sense to use it than let it rot in warehouses back home." The second warehouse held food, and here the scale achieved a kind of brutal poetry that made Mendel think of Old Testament descriptions of abundance flowing like water. 50-pound sacks of flour stacked 40 high, each pallet representing enough bread to feed 1,000 people for a week, multiplied across hundreds of pallets that filled the warehouse from wall to wall. Canned meat and powdered milk and coffee and sugar and rice and beans and chocolate bars still in their original military packaging. Olive drab wrappers stamped with production dates from March and April 1945, when the war in Europe was ending, and American factories were already pivoting toward peacetime production, but still operating at wartime tempo, because the momentum of that industrial machine could not be stopped quickly even when victory removed the urgency. Patterson explained that the depot processed 2,000 tons of food per day. The trucks departed every 15 minutes for distribution points throughout the region. That the American military government had calculated caloric requirements for the German civilian population and was meeting those requirements, despite infrastructure damage and agricultural disruption that would have meant mass starvation under any other circumstances. "We're feeding them better than we fed you," Hoffman muttered beside Mendel, his voice carrying bitter amusement at the absurdity of the situation. The civilians who supported Hitler, who cheered when the Wehrmacht invaded Poland and France, they're getting American charity while we rotted in trenches eating sawdust bread. It was true, and not true simultaneously. The prisoners in American custody received adequate nutrition by the standards of the Geneva Convention. But the sheer abundance flowing into German cities exceeded anything Mendel had witnessed even during the war's early years, when victory seemed inevitable, and the propaganda ministry promised a 1,000-year Reich built on conquered territories and enslaved populations. The turning point came in the third warehouse, where clothing and blankets and shoes waited for distribution. And here Mendel saw something that finally shattered his ability to maintain analytical distance from what he was witnessing. An American sergeant was showing a group of German workers how to process a shipment of children's winter coats that had just arrived from a factory in Massachusetts. Coats made from good wool with proper buttons and inner linings that would actually keep a child warm through the alpine winter that would arrive in 5 months. The sergeant held up one coat and examined it with the critical eye of someone checking quality and apparently finding some minor defect in the stitching. He tossed it onto a pile marked for return to the manufacturer rather than including it in the distribution batch. The coat was perfectly functional, would have been treasured by any German family whose children wore threadbare clothing, patched and repatched until the original fabric disappeared beneath layers of desperate repairs. But American quality standards rejected it as inadequate, and the system could afford that rejection because there were 10,000 more coats in the warehouse and 10,000 more arriving next week. The systemic scale expansion revealed itself through documents that Mendel obtained from Patterson during the return journey to the camp. Papers that the lieutenant handed over with casual disregard for military security, because apparently the Americans saw no danger in letting enemy prisoners understand the full scope of the machinery that had crushed them. The first document was a War Department logistics summary dated May 1945 that detailed supply allocations for the European theater of operations during the final month of combat. 18 million tons of ammunition expended, 400,000 vehicles in active service consuming 2 million gallons of fuel per day, rations sufficient to feed 3 million soldiers plus equivalent numbers of liberated prisoners and refugees, medical supplies including 12 million units of penicillin distributed through field hospitals that treated combat casualties and disease with equal efficiency. And all of this sustained across supply lines stretching 6,000 miles from American factories to German battlefields, without the system ever experiencing critical shortages that might have slowed operations or forced commanders to husband resources, the way German generals had been doing since 1943. The numbers cascaded through Mendel's consciousness like an avalanche, gaining momentum as it descended. American aircraft flew 400,000 sorties in March 1945 alone, dropping 70,000 tons of bombs on German industrial targets and transportation networks that were already so degraded that continued bombardment seemed almost vindictive, except that the bomber crews kept flying because the industrial system that built their aircraft and produced their ordnance had no off switch and could not be throttled back quickly even when strategic necessity no longer demanded maximum effort. Tank production continued at full capacity through April 1945, adding another 2,000 Shermans to an inventory that already exceeded immediate requirements by comfortable margins. And these excess vehicles were simply parked in depots, awaiting disposition decisions that would eventually send many of them to occupation duties or allied nations or scrapyards, where perfectly functional machines would be melted down and recycled because storage costs exceeded their residual value. The shipyards kept launching Liberty ships at the rate of 3 per day, even after German U-boats had been hunted to extinction, and the Atlantic crossing became routine enough that merchant sailors complained about boredom rather than fear. And these ships joined a merchant fleet so vast that the United States could have sustained its entire war effort using only half the available tonnage while the other half sat idle in port, waiting for cargo that never materialized. Mendel compiled his own statistics during the long evenings in Tent 47B, cross-referencing American documents with German production figures he remembered from economic reports that had circulated through Wehrmacht headquarters, before optimistic projections gave way to desperate reality. Germany had produced 39,000 tanks during 6 years of total war, while America built 88,000 in 4 years of ramping production. Germany manufactured 119,000 aircraft, while America produced 300,000. Germany's steel output peaked at 30 million tons annually, while America sustained 89 million tons. And these raw numbers failed to capture the additional advantage of American factories operating in homeland security without bombardment or resource shortages or labor conscription that pulled skilled workers away from production lines and replaced them with prisoners and forced laborers who lacked expertise and motivation. The mathematics were brutal and undeniable. The kind of calculations that allowed no room for ideology or propaganda or wishful thinking about wonder weapons and strategic genius overcoming material disadvantages. The electrical power differential alone explained everything. Germany generated 63 billion kilowatt hours in its peak production year, while America generated 180 billion. And that gap meant American factories could operate continuously without brownouts or rationing, while German industry struggled through power shortages that idled assembly lines and forced managers to choose between producing tanks or aircraft or ammunition, but never all three simultaneously at desired levels. Aluminum production told the same story in even starker terms. America smelted 900,000 tons of aluminum annually by 1944, while Germany managed 190,000 tons. And aircraft construction required aluminum in quantities that made the German aviation industry's collapse almost inevitable once strategic bombing disrupted bauxite imports and electrical generation capacity. Rubber production through synthetic processes gave America 500,000 tons per year compared to Germany's 115,000 tons. And without rubber, the Wehrmacht's vaunted mobility dissolved into horses and bicycles and soldiers marching on foot, while American armies rolled forward in trucks that never stopped moving because fuel and spare parts and replacement tires appeared with the inevitability of sunrise. The food statistics carried their own terrible logic. American agriculture produced 130 million tons of wheat, corn, and other grains in 1944, enough to feed the domestic population with surpluses sufficient for export and military requirements, and still maintain livestock herds that provided meat and dairy products at pre-war consumption levels. While German food production collapsed under labor shortages and fertilizer restrictions, and Allied bombing of transportation networks until civilian rations dropped below 2,000 calories per day, and soldiers in the field survived on whatever they could forage or steal from occupied territories. Coffee and cigarettes became symbols of this disparity, luxury goods that American logistics distributed with casual abundance, because tobacco plantations in North Carolina and coffee imports from Brazil continued flowing into a supply system that saw no reason to deny frontline troops or rear echelon personnel or even enemy prisoners the small comforts that maintained morale and reminded everyone that America fought this war without requiring its citizens or soldiers to embrace genuine hardship or sacrifice beyond the loss of loved ones who died in combat. Mendel showed his calculations to Dietrich one evening in mid-June, spreading the documents across a table in the recreation tent and walking the former Hauptmann through the mathematics step by step, expecting resistance or denial, but finding instead a kind of hollow acceptance that suggested Dietrich had already reached the same conclusions through his own observations, and simply lacked the will to articulate them. The enemy realization moment crystallized for Dietrich on an afternoon in late June, when American guards distributed ice cream to the prisoners during a recreational period. Actual ice cream made with real cream and sugar and served in paper cups that bore cheerful advertisements for a brand called Dairy Queen that apparently operated restaurants throughout the American Midwest where civilians could purchase frozen desserts any day of the week without ration coupons or special authorization. Dietrich stood in the distribution line with his paper cup held in both hands and stared at the pale substance melting slowly in the summer heat. And something fundamental broke behind his eyes, not his pride, which had already been thoroughly demolished by months of defeat and captivity, but rather his entire framework for understanding how nations functioned and what was possible within the constraints of economics and geography and human organization. He sat down heavily on a bench near the baseball diamond where American soldiers and German prisoners had begun playing informal games together. And he ate his ice cream in silence while tears ran down his weathered face and dripped onto his gray prison uniform. And Mendel sat beside him without speaking because there were no words adequate to the moment. "They make ice cream for prisoners," Dietrich finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They ship it here in refrigerated trucks, using fuel and rubber and steel that could serve military purposes. And they give it to captured enemy soldiers because why not? Because the system produces so much that denying us ice cream would accomplish nothing except cruelty for its own sake." He finished eating and crumpled the paper cup in his fist. "We told our soldiers they were fighting for survival against an enemy that would exterminate the German people if we lost. We said the Allies wanted to turn Germany into a pastoral wasteland where survivors would starve among the ruins. And instead, they give us ice cream. Not as mercy, not as charity, but because their logistics manuals probably have a line item for prisoner morale enhancement and some captain in a supply office filled out requisition forms. And the ice cream showed up on schedule like everything else in this obscene machine that never stops producing." The waste haunted Mendel more than the abundance. American soldiers who threw away half-full coffee cups because a fresh pot had just been brewed. Who tossed cigarettes after smoking them halfway because another pack waited in their pockets. Who left uneaten food on their mess trays that would be scraped into garbage bins rather than saved for the next meal. A German officer who had survived Stalingrad and watched men kill each other over crusts of bread found himself assigned to garbage detail one afternoon and discovered that the American mess halls discarded more edible food in a single day than his entire company had consumed during the final week of the Stalingrad siege. And he sat among the garbage bins and laughed until the laughter turned to sobs, and an American medic had to sedate him because his mind could not reconcile what he was seeing with what he had experienced and believed about the nature of war and scarcity and survival. Patterson found Mendel in the recreation tent in early July and gave him a final document, a copy of the Marshall Plan preliminary outline that proposed spending $12 billion to rebuild European infrastructure and restart civilian economies across both Allied and former enemy nations. $12 billion, Patterson said, his finger tapping the figure on the page. "That's about what we spent in a single year of war production at peak tempo. We're going to spend it over 4 years to rebuild what we destroyed. And Congress will approve it because the alternative is chaos and starvation and probably another war in 20 years. And nobody wants that." He sat down across from Mendel and lit a cigarette, offering the pack with a gesture that had become routine between them. "You understand now, right? This wasn't about tactics or strategy or even military genius. It was about industry. It was about a system that could produce so much material that we could afford to be generous with our enemies, because crushing you completely would cost more than rebuilding you as trading partners." The closing thesis formed itself in Mendel's mind over the following weeks as summer deepened into August, and rumors began circulating about prisoner releases and repatriation programs that would send German soldiers home to begin the work of reconstruction under Allied supervision. It was not tactics that had defeated the Wehrmacht, not the brilliance of Eisenhower, or the courage of individual soldiers, or the moral righteousness of the Allied cause. Though all these factors played their roles in the grand narrative that would be written by historians in decades to come, it was the industrial inevitability of a system that could build one heavy bomber per hour, that could generate enough electricity to smelt aluminum in quantities sufficient to construct fleets of aircraft larger than the entire Luftwaffe at its peak. That could feed and equip and sustain armies across oceans, while simultaneously maintaining civilian living standards high enough that American families complained about butter rationing without experiencing genuine hunger. That could afford to treat captured enemies with coffee and cigarettes and ice cream, because the marginal cost of such gestures barely registered against the tsunami of production that had overwhelmed every defense and shattered every illusion about the possibility of German victory through willpower or technological superiority or the mythical advantages of authoritarian efficiency over democratic chaos. Mendel returned to the poplar trees where the convoy had stopped on that first day in late April. Walking the kilometer from the camp during a free period when prisoners were allowed to move within designated boundaries. The trees still shivered in the wind, their leaves now full and green with summer growth. And he could smell diesel exhaust from trucks moving along the nearby road, carrying supplies to camps and hospitals and distribution centers throughout the occupation zone. He thought about the chains that had waited at his feet unused, about the coffee that had tasted like a miracle, about the mathematics that had seemed impossible until reality demonstrated otherwise through the relentless accumulation of evidence that no amount of denial could refute. The war had not ended because Germany lacked courage, or because its soldiers failed to fight hard enough, or because its leaders made tactical errors that better generalship might have corrected. It had ended because one nation had built a machine that could produce material in quantities that transformed warfare from a contest of wills into a simple equation where the side with more factories and more power plants and more workers and more resources would inevitably grind down any opponent regardless of tactical skill or strategic vision. The chains lay coiled and forgotten in some warehouse now, a symbol of expectations that reality had disproven. And Mendel stood beneath the poplar trees and watched American trucks roll past in endless succession, and understood finally that he had been defeated not by enemies he could see, but by an industrial system so vast that it could afford to be merciful because mercy cost nothing against profits measured in billions, and production measured in millions, and a future being rebuilt on the foundation of overwhelming material superiority that made every other consideration secondary to the mathematics of steel and aluminum and electrical power flowing through networks that spanned a continent and reached across oceans to reshape the world.